When I first started this project, I built way too many mechanics without thinking how they'd all fit together to make a fun game. Since then, I've stripped everything back, and now, after a bit more thought, I'm starting to put those mechanics back in, one at a time. The most recent example was re-adding defenders. I wanted to give the player options for defeating enemies, other than hitting them directly with boulders, so I let the player train defenders that would attack enemies for them. There's an archer that will shoot enemies for damage, as well as a wizard that will slow enemies, making them easier to hit with boulders. I also wanted to limit how many defenders the player could have at one time in a way that was more interesting than just the purchase price, so I added a holy boulder that converts enemies and allows them to be trained as defenders. There's still some work to do to balance everything, as it's pretty overpowered that the boulder just kills anything it touches, but for now, let's dive in and have a look at how I implemented these new features. I'd already implemented archers and wizards, so I just needed to re-enable the bottom toolbar. Since all the related code worked around button presses on the UI, it just kinda worked. I did notice some issues with the AI not choosing the best target, so I added it to my bug list to fix up later on. Next, I wanted to limit how many defenders the player could train, so I added a trainable unit count variable to the player and added it to the saving and loading code so it would persist between sessions. I then added this count to the UI, which is pretty messy and ugly at this point. Another thing I'll have to improve moving forwards. As a programmer, I definitely struggle with the visual side of things, and I think it shows, so I'm always open to suggestions in the comments. After connecting the trainable unit count UI to the variable in the player, it was time to test that it worked correctly. To do this, I added code to the debug menu to increase the player's trainable unit count and connected it to the UI. I am starting to run out of space in the debug menu, so I may need to look at other solutions, maybe different pages, or perhaps a console with text commands so they won't take up UI space. At any rate, it was another item for my ever-growing list of refactoring opportunities. A quick test showed that the trainable unit count and UI was working just as expected. Next, I needed to connect the count to the training of defenders. This was as simple as adding an early return to the functions that train archers and wizards if the player has no trainable units. You'll notice they're basically the same function, and once I add more defenders, I'll move this into a common defender training function to reduce the duplication. A playtest showed the player was successfully unable to train defenders if their trainable unit count was 0, but training a defender wasn't reducing the count. This was a simple fix, and this kind of little oversight happens all the time, which is why I find expecting things not to work the first time is a helpful attitude to have. Another playtest showed everything was working correctly, and it was time to start adding the holy boulder so the player could obtain trainable units without the debug menu. The first step was to add a new entry to the projectile ID enum. Next, I made a prefab for the holy boulder and added a glowing particle effect for while it's in flight. I added a reference to the prefab on the game manager, which has become so big that it's very difficult to find things in the inspector. Even though I do really like this centralized approach, I have to admit it could benefit from being split up. Even if all I did was move some data into some scriptable objects, I think it would definitely make it more manageable. Finally, I needed a particle effect to be played when the boulder landed, so after adding that, it was time to change the code to let the player start launching holy boulders. The first step was to modify the boulder spawning code, as well as the start round code to set the player's default projectile to the holy boulder. Modifying game code like this is something I do all the time, as it lets me quickly test that things work before incorporating the feature properly. This time, a test showed there were a few issues. The boulder impact radius wasn't being shown while in flight, the impact effect was way too small, and its size wasn't scaling with radius upgrades. The invisible impact radius was because I was only showing it for certain projectile types. I originally put this in so that it would only show for boulder projectiles, but my to-do comment shows I knew that was a bad solution. I decided to follow my own advice and replace this check with a show impact radius variable, and modified the spawn boulder code to set this to be true, so that all player boulders would show their impact radius. Looking at the impact effect not scaling, I noticed that scaling the game object didn't change the particle size like it did for other effects. I went down a bit of a rabbit hole building a system to change individual size variables on the particle systems, and nearly finished it before I realized my silly mistake. The scaling mode on the particle systems was set to local instead of hierarchy, and after changing this, the particles correctly resized based on their parent scale. Despite fixing this, the impact effect still wasn't scaling in-game with radius upgrades. This ended up being a similar issue to the invisible impact radius, where behavior was based on a particular projectile ID and the holy boulder was missing. This was a quick fix, and a test showed the impact effect was now scaling correctly. However, I noticed another helpful to-do comment, and once again decided to follow my own advice. I added a scale impact effect variable, and replaced all the projectile ID checks with a single check of this value. As with the show impact radius variable, I modified the spawn boulder code to set this to be true. With the boulder launching correctly, it was time to add it to the toolbar. The first step was to remove the flaming and gravity boulder buttons and add one for the holy boulder. I'll put these back in the game shortly, but since I'm in the process of reintegrating mechanics one at a time, the archers and wizards are the focus for now. While connecting the button to the game manager, I found another to-do comment suggesting I wrap the toolbar buttons in a class. This would reduce a lot of the duplicated code, as you can see, but since it's pretty minor, I decided to fix it up later, probably when I re-add the other boulder types. Next, I added the holy boulder to the code that sets the player's active projectile type, commenting out the code about mana cost, which is another mechanic I've taken out for now that I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about. Clicking on the button to set the projectile was now handled, but you can also change boulders with a hotkey, so I quickly added that too. Another playtest showed the holy boulder was working nicely, and the next step was to add its on-hit behavior. This will definitely need balancing later on, but for now I made it so that any enemy the boulder hits will instantly be killed, and the player will get 1 added to their trainable unit count. The last step was to add the impact sound. Each sound is an element in an array on the audio manager, and the audio type of SFX or music lets me separate the volume between the two. After adding code to play the sound when the boulder lands, the final playtest showed that the holy boulder was working just as intended. So while it's great that I've been able to add the holy boulder to make the defender's mechanic a bit more complete, this devlog honestly felt like one step forwards and one step backwards. I'll need to put more thought into balancing the holy boulder, since it's clearly overpowered at the moment, and I'll also need to think how I want player progression to work in terms of unlocking these new mechanics. I could definitely benefit from putting more thought into design before implementing mechanics, but I also think it's just part of my style. I'm a games programmer in my day job, so I'm always going to tend towards the programming side of things. Also, since I work full-time and can only work on this project in my spare time, I tend to look for tasks that are easy wins I can finish quickly, and usually those are programming tasks. I find design work needs a bit more focus, which can sometimes be hard to manage. At any rate, thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, or if you have any suggestions for what I should add to the game, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.